Hey, everybody. I decided to talk a little bit about misery. Misery. Um, oh, by the way, it's New Year's Day, and Happy New Year to everybody. And hopefully, you all are prosperous and well this upcoming year. But anyway, back to the subject matter at hand, that is misery. Misery. We know what misery is. It's suffering. It's it's feeling bad. It's being sick, um, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically. It's pain at every level, and we call that misery. Um, Oftentimes, I think misery persists with people, and it not only persists, but it gets stronger and more powerful over time because I think there's a misconception about misery that people tend to take for granted. I know that oftentimes misery is falsely promoted as virtue. We got to get away from trying to see misery as being virtuous that we can go and display in front of others and use misery to be inspiration to other people. What better way to use misery as an inspiration other than casting off misery to show people that they can get rid of their misery as opposed to enduring their misery, being brave and suffering in bravery. I don't personally. I think that we often uh, have that mentality because we misunderstand things about the Bible that has to do with organized religious teachings. And one of those things is that we we have a cross to bear, and I think, well, I go with the notion that the Messiah says you got to get rid of that heavy yoke, and he talked about his yoke being lighter, and take upon yourself his yoke because his yoke is lighter. Okay, misery. There's a false idea that misery equates to virtue. And the reason why I think that that is because there's an underlying unconscious idea that misery builds inner spiritual strength. They say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I think we need to rethink that whole idea. Misery doesn't build inner strength. Misery contaminates the mind. It invades the psyche and it grows within the psyche until such a point that it is able to attack the spirit and it begins to destroy people spiritually. Once it gets in the mind and floods and crowds out the mind, your mental energy is thoroughly invested in being miserable, then it starts to attack your spirit. And that's spiritual destruction. Misery causes spiritual destruction. It doesn't make you stronger, it weakens you, renders you unto death. Once misery invades the mind and crowds out your mental space, your mind space, to all you can do is fight against negative thinking and it starts to attack the spirit, at that point, it begins to attack the body, and the body begins to experience all manner of unnatural breakdowns. In other words, you get sick. So we have to begin to understand that we need to use whatever spiritual power we have left to begin to cast away misery. As long as there's spiritual power within you, then you can use that power to cast away misery. For instance, if you have just an inkling of spiritual power left, that's just enough to be able to use to cast away an inkling of misery. So you use the little bit of spiritual power that you have, and you cast away a little bit of misery. What does that do? That creates a little void in your psychic system. And what happens with that is that now that that little bit of misery is gone, and nature abhors a vacuum, that little bit void is filled with a measure of your spiritual power. So not only have you cast away a little bit of misery, you've also grown a little bit in spirit. So your spirit has a little extra strength because you used it wisely. You used it to cast away a little bit of misery. And now that you have a little bit extra spiritual power, you can use that little extra power plus what you already had from the beginning to cast away a greater portion of misery. And what happens with that? Well, the same thing that just happened. Another vacuum is formed in your psyche. A vacuum that's a little bit bigger than the previous vacuum because remember, you have extra spiritual power now. Your spirit has grown a measure. So you have another vacuum which is a little bit larger than a previous vacuum, and your spirit feels that. Now your spirit has grown even more so than it did the first time. And you could use that methodology to gradually and consistently cast away spirit and cast away misery, cast away misery and grow in spirit. Your growth, your spiritual growth is a conscious choice. It really is. And you can begin to look at life differently. You can begin to see your misery differently as something that's not needed, as something that you don't need to use to show the world or show God that you're suffering in virtue. The two don't mix. And that's one of the dilemmas of this whole thing about good and evil and duality is that it causes us to mismatch things and to see things in backwards manner. Misery and virtue doesn't go together. You shouldn't be suffering. You shouldn't be sick. You shouldn't be miserable. Keep that in mind. Begin to cast away your misery. Begin to take care of your own spirit. You can even start by watching how the world insists on being miserable. That in and of itself will cause the awakening process to be jump-started in your own psyche. Now, there's a big difference between casually observing, impartially observing the world, as opposed to thinking that you're seeing the world and then going around and trying to tell people about their own misery. Big difference. That's something you shouldn't do, because that's actually something you can't do anyway. I know we mean well, but the problem with that is that misery is customized to, for, and by the individual. Your misery won't have the same impact or the same meaning as another person's misery. So when you're trying to preach to people or teach people about misery and about how they can discard their own misery, about how they should quit indulging in misery, they're not going to really understand what you're talking about. You're going to be talking from the vantage point of your own misery, which won't mean anything from their miserable vantage point. Yeah, misery is customized, custom made, custom designed by the individual. It doesn't mean the same from one individual to the next. And this is why the world stays miserable. This is why. One person thinks that they understand another's misery and they really don't. Like, I can only talk to you from the vantage point of my inner understanding. It's not like I can tap into your mind and take away misery or whatnot. That's really God's job. And it's your job to cast away misery first. You have to cast away misery. And in this manner, God is waiting on you. We try to promote philosophies about waiting on the Lord, waiting on Jesus. That's really not how it works. God is waiting on you to cast away your misery. By you casting away misery, mental misery first, which is your conscious choice, once you succeed, the process begins at a spiritual level, and it happens naturally. No effort on your part. So we need to learn what it means to cast away misery. We need to understand that misery, there's no virtue in misery. And when you cast away misery and your spiritual light has become illumined, then that's all you need to do. You begin to live victoriously. Victoriously, you begin to live in the light. And at the appointed time, when the Lord really does return, in the real way, the real natural way, not the religious way, not the fairy tale way, when the Lord actually returns and you've uncovered your light, you've removed that veil of misery, you will be lifted up and taken to a greater level of life. Anyway, that's it. Once again, I wish you all a happy new year, and be safe. God bless.